Was returned to his widow, she held a funeral for him. Irina stroked his ring and said, "He was my whole world, my whole family."
Yogita Limuye. If a politician wants to be elected, they have to be prepared to face the public. They might try to only hold rallies with enthusiastic supporters, but if they do want to win anyone else over, at some point they can expect to have to address hard questions about their track record, their finances, and their moral character. In the Philippines, it is election time. The front runner in the race to become president is the son of the country's late dictator, Ferdinand Marcos. But as Howard Johnson tried to ask questions, he encountered violent pushback from various quarters, especially online.
The comment on social media was certainly clear. "I hope you and your family die in misery." Here we go again. It's the second time I'd faced a barrage of abuse on social media while working in the Philippines. This time it was for asking the son of a dictator a question. The first time was in 2018. That was days after we broadcast a documentary exploring attacks on the country's democratic institutions by the country's president, Rodrigo Duterte. The film also explored the political rehabilitation of the Marcos family more than 30 years after President Ferdinand Marcos and his wife Imelda were unceremoniously ousted from the presidential palace following a popular uprising. My Facebook, Instagram and YouTube accounts were flooded with hateful and intimidating messages. Much of the language was repetitive, as if following a script. Accusations of bias and fake news were top of the list. This week, the abuse came after I had posed a question to Ferdinand Marcos' son. 64-year-old Bongbong Marcos is an on-off ally of outgoing President Duterte and is currently the frontrunner in the contest to be the Philippines' next president. I had asked him on camera if he could really be a good president if he doesn't answer serious questions. During the election campaign, journalists from respected critical news organizations have seen their access to him severely restricted. Bongbong also pulled out of a number of high-profile TV debates, citing problems with his timetable and the format of the programs. In one case, he was approached by a reporter from the news website Rappler. Their chief executive officer won the Nobel Peace Prize last year for the site's investigative work. But the journalist had her phone pulled and she was pushed away. But interviews and debate appearances have been granted to pro-Marcos news networks like SMNI News, which is owned by President Rodrigo Duterte's spiritual advisor, Pastor Apollo Quiboloy. He is currently wanted by the FBI over numerous sex trafficking charges, some involving children. Mr. Quiboloy denies the charges. At a rally just outside Manila, I'd approached Bongbong without warning. It's a last resort if all other interview requests are denied. The same type of interview technique here is known as an ambush, which somehow makes asking a question in the public's interest sound more like a terrorist act. Bongbong evaded the question, so I asked him if he was hiding something from the public. He laughed and promptly walked away. The trolls were quick to react. BBC is the Communist New People's Army. BBC is a terrorist, read one. It would be funny if the country hadn't just passed an anti-terror law that could see you detained without a warrant. This latest assault on my social media platforms numbered in the thousands of comments and lasted a week. Many were either racist or homophobic. But as before, it stopped abruptly, as if a switch had been turned off. Since 2018, we've come to know these attacks as coordinated, inauthentic behavior. Someone somewhere uses a bank of SIM cards to log into different fake accounts to proliferate a message, to divert attention away from the journalist's original question. In my case, the narrative built an image of me being a disrespectful foreigner because of the direct manner by which I asked Mr. Marcos the question. An ally of Bongbong said I shouldn't act like I was a master and Mr. Marcos my slave. Some genuine members of the public did then pick up on the new theme, incited enough to join in the abuse. I just hope someone will slash your neck for besmirching the Filipinos' reputation, for example. So I'm left asking myself whether the same apparatus is being used to attack me again, and if so, who is behind it? And I'm not the only one to experience this. Journalists here are repeatedly called hornlists or prostitutes online, making truth-seeking sound like a red light enterprise. Beyond that, members of the public who've posted comments in favour of opposition candidates have reported intimidation online, so toxic that they've decided to stop using social media. The situation has got some journalists worried about the future of the profession here, given that Bongbong Marcos's father used martial law to shutter the press during his authoritarian rule. Bongbong's supporters believe the Marcos family have been wronged by the independent media reporting of their legacy. Many believe his promise to unite the country and make it rise again. But critics say Bongbong's election campaign shows he is dishonest, immune to criticism and surrounded by cronies. They fear if he's elected, he could pick up exactly where his father left off.
Howard Johnson in Manila. You're listening to From Our Own Correspondent here on the BBC World Service with me, Pascal Harter. In Singapore, the state halted executions during the height of the COVID pandemic, but courts continued to hand down death penalties over online video conferencing. The approach could be seen as emblematic of the country's severe justice system. There are few grounds for leniency or compassion in Singapore's legal code. By and large, most Singaporeans have remained in favour of capital punishment, though a recent high-profile case showed that this support is not unconditional. Saranjana Tawari.
Marina Bay in the heart of Singapore offers the best view of the downtown skyline, a fascinating mix of colonial buildings and futuristic skyscrapers. Singapore is cosmopolitan and multi-ethnic, and there's hardly any crime. This is a city that exudes wealth, pragmatism, and utter safety. It may just be the safest place I've ever been. I walk the tidy streets at all times of the night, often leaving my front door unlocked, and I don't have to think too carefully about my belongings when I'm out and about. But what makes it so safe? Elaborate surveillance and the threat of criminal prosecution for even the smallest of offences. To an outsider, it can get rather overwhelming. During the pandemic, the city imposed tight controls over everyone's daily life. Expats were prosecuted for breaking social distancing rules. One man was even deported for not wearing a mask. Others were tried and fined for breaking quarantine. That may be behind us for now, but the end of pandemic restrictions has coincided with the resumption of another practice that Singapore's government says is essential to keeping the city safe. It executes drug dealers, hanging them at dawn. I hadn't come across this since moving here. There had been a pause on executions during the pandemic. And although the use of the death penalty is largely supported, one recent case has ignited uneasiness in this island nation. In late April, Singapore executed a Malaysian man called Nagentran Dharmalingam. In 2009, Nagan, as he's known, had been found with 43 grams of heroin, about 3 tablespoons worth, strapped to his thigh. He was apparently trying to smuggle the drug into Singapore from Malaysia. The following year, he was sentenced to death. As the date of his execution approached, his family filed several appeals and clemency requests, arguing that his life be spared on the grounds that he was intellectually disabled. An assessment claimed he had an IQ of just 69. Singaporean authorities systematically rejected his appeals, reiterating that the courts found that Nagan knew what he was doing when he committed the crime. Singapore's newspapers, which are strictly controlled by the government, told the same story, publishing lengthy articles on why he was guilty. Malaysian dailies, in contrast, quoted emotional pleas from Nagan's family. The same 3 photos of Nagan were used again and again. A slender, handsome man with clear eyes and a manicured beard, taken during happier times. The day before Nagan was due to be hanged, his mother made a final attempt to stop his execution. She spoke through a Tamil translator in court, filing the case without a lawyer because she couldn't find one who would take it on. Here was a woman trying to save her young son with practically no resources. They're saying the mother has no standing, an activist told me from court. They're saying her case might be abusing the court process, prosecutor seemed angry that she'd even made it to court. At the end of the hearing, Nagin and his family reached through a gap in a glass screen to grasp each other's hands tightly as they wept. His cries of "Ma" carried across the courtroom. Nagin's face seemed to be everywhere that Singapore's government couldn't touch. Malaysian media, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Human rights groups were going on international TV calling the case a miscarriage of justice. "It's so insane, it makes me angry," one expat friend messaged me. Another local friend told me he expected the execution to go ahead. "I'm not for it myself, but Singaporeans are mostly pro-death penalty," he added. Singapore's government doesn't notify the public when it carries out these executions. It was Nagin's family who finally confirmed it, releasing a new photo of him, taken in the days before his execution. He was wearing a favourite outfit, perched on a high stool in a grey and black polo shirt, blue jeans and white trainers. He looked like he'd aged by more than his 10 years on death row, which was largely spent in solitary confinement. He had far less hair. Days before Nagin was executed, around 400 people gathered in the one park in Singapore in which protests are allowed without prior police approval. Those who attended were surprised by the turnout. They told me people had carried placards and chanted, a very unusual sight in politically passive Singapore. Nagin's case has galvanized many here, the organizer of the protest told me. He said it had made everyone realize how unforgiving the country's punishment system is. "I'm encouraged by the number of young people acting now," he said. "I'm optimistic."
That was Suranjana Tiwari.